So welcome to the afternoon sessions. My name is Stephanie, and I'm a software engineer at Bloomberg, as was mentioned. I'm relatively new to all things Jupyter. I joined our data science platform team last year, and since then I've been part of a group of engineers working to customize Jupyter and JupyterLab for our platform. I'm really excited today to share with you some of my experiences in terraforming the JupyterLab environment.
And my name is Paul Ivanov, and I'm also a software engineer at Bloomberg. And I just noticed that it's our slide that has you listed as developer and engineer, and we're in the same position. I don't know. Yeah. It's our fault. Our fault.
My bad.
I've been at Bloomberg for about 2 years, but I've been involved with Jupyter and IPython for about the last 10 years.
Great. So a couple audience polls. How many of you raised your hands to answer questions during Tech Talks? Me. Awesome. OK, of those people, who hasn't used JupyterLab before? Oh, OK, so a lot of people have. Good stuff. Of people who have used JupyterLab, who has written an extension before or worked with extensions? Awesome. Great. And equally as important of a question, who has read the book or seen the movie The Martian? Awesome. We will come to that later and repeatedly throughout this talk. OK, so I am going to hand the open mic. Actually, sorry, we're going to switch slides. OK, so that being said, it's nice to have goals in life. Our goal for today, actually, Paul has a poem to read.
I do.
Read it now. Yeah. Oh, later. You're going to do it later. OK.
In a bit.
Coming soon. Previews.
Yes.
All right. So it's nice to have goals in life. Our goal for today's session is to demystify customization. So it doesn't matter if you spent 10 years, like Paul, or 10 days working on this platform. We're going to give you resources today to help you spin up some useful environment customizations. We really want to make it easier and less overwhelming for people like you to get started customizing JupyterLab. So in today's session, we're going to be talking about what it's like to live with stock JupyterLab and talking about some of the customizations that you can do to settings and themes right out of the box. Then we're going to walk through what's involved in installing third-party extensions. And then we're going to end by walking through some of the extensions we've built and going through that. So now I'm officially going to hand over the open mic to Paul for another take on what we're going to be doing in today's talk.
Thank you. Recall the Martian story told, the depths of loneliness and cold of being stranded, outlook grim, survival chances slim. And so it goes, potatoes froze. To persevere, must lean on science, engineering both. Don't panic, compute escape velocity, use orbital mechanics. But now we find ourselves on Jupyter for good. We have a lab to start, and we'll build more. Transform a planet, make it yours. Inhabit with your values, cores of the beliefs you hold. Each instrument artisanal, bespoke. The fear of being stranded, gone. By Jove, there's science to be done. Extensions to install, enable, code to write and run. The time is now. We'll show you how.
Great. All right. So on that note, let's launch. All right. So before we dive into extensions, I want to give a really quick high-level overview of the JupyterLab architecture for those of you who aren't as familiar with it. At its core, JupyterLab is a collection of extensions, or as I like to say, extensions all the way down. So the extensible environment itself consists of a core application object and a base set of extensions. So I want to emphasize here that you can customize or enhance any part of JupyterLab, from themes to editors to renderers like rich output in notebooks. So later in this talk, we're going to walk through how extensions can be used to do things like adding menu items, adding icons in your toolbar, and setting up custom key bindings. All right. So before we jump into some of our custom extensions, I do want to take some time to highlight some of the default extensions that you get out of the box. So in this screenshot here that we have of JupyterLab, one of our core extensions that you get out of the box, again, is images. So on the bottom right-hand side, you can see an image, and the images extension itself adds a widget factory that is for displaying images files. You also see a file browser on the left-hand side. The file browser extension itself is what creates the file browser object and the document manager, and the file browser to the sidebar over there. The editor is, again, another extension. You see that in the center console. And that adds a widget factory for displaying editable source files. And last one that I want to highlight, because we're actually going to show it in action in our next slide, is the terminal. And this adds the ability to create command prompt terminals, which is actually pretty useful when you're working in the UI.
So I'm going to go into here and open up a new terminal. And look at that. We have a terminal. You can do all the standard terminal things. And one of the things that you might want to do is install a new extension. So the command for that will be JupyterLab. Can you see that? Or should I? Let's do this. JupyterLab extension install. And let's go out to the internet. Hopefully, I'm still on the internet. XKCD extension.
And so what Paul is entering here now is the extension name. You also have the option of specifying the extension version, but if you don't, it's going to default to installing the latest version published for that extension package. We'll get into packages a little bit later in the talk.
And we'll also notice that it didn't work. So that was planned. The version of JupyterLab we're using for this is the latest one that released, but this extension hasn't been updated. So this will be a pattern that you will also run into as you start to install extension and JupyterLab moves forward and you've updated to the new JupyterLab. An extension you might be using won't be updated immediately to work with the latest version. So the way that we're going to fix it for now is I happen to have cloned the Git source code of that repository. And I'm going to run the same command that we ran before, except now I'm going to say install dot for installing the thing that is right in this directory, all those files. So this is going to be the typical output that you get. We're going to go out to NPM, where the JavaScript packages are hosted, and fetch all the dependencies of this extension, grab them, and then webpackify JupyterLab back, sort of terraforming it back into place. While that's going, this was kind of tedious, so I'm going to show you another way of doing that. That's sort of a preview of things to come. So if you go into settings and go into the advanced settings editor, you'll find that there's an extension manager there now. It didn't used to be there just a couple of months ago, but it's there now. And what you have to do to get it is, by default, it will not be enabled. So what you'll have to do is come in here and say, like it just did, enabled :true to get it. And let me disable it and show you what happens. So I've disabled it, and I'm going to save that. I'm going to reload. OK, so it doesn't appear here, and so, sorry, in testing this, I left it enabled. But here, let's re-enable it. So when you enable it, I hit save, I hit Control-S, it's giving me this warning message. When you install JupyterLab extensions from the open internet, they will be able to execute code on your machine. So you better trust what's out there, right? So this is sort of what this extension manager says is like, hey, you're on your own. We're going to allow you to install things, but we trust that you're responsible enough to do this, or you're doing this in a containerized enough fashion where you won't care. So we say, yes, OK, it's great. And what that did is that added back this extension manager left pane, and now we can see that it is indeed that extension that we installed over here in the terminal. This is what a successful extension looks like. It successfully webpackified everything, and now it's listed here. And another way of getting a list of the JupyterLab extensions that you have installed from the terminal is JupyterLab extension list. There you go. It's showing it to us, and it's disabled right now, but I can enable it. And so enabling and disabling extensions is much faster. Once you've installed an extension, you can enable it temporarily and then disable it temporarily, and that doesn't require a whole webpackify phase. So this is the extension that's used in the tutorials. So I'm going to say it provides a new command, an XKCD comic.
Before you launch it, we don't officially endorse any
yes, that's right.
XKCD comics.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not responsible for the XKCD. It's on random, so I don't know what XKCD comic is going to come up. No, different one. To switch again. Make it go away. Give us a good one. Is that good? I can't read.
Ship it.
Ship it. All right. Yay! We did it. So this provided a new pane, and Yeah, so that's installing an extension.
That's third party.
A third-party extension. So this is a slide overview for what we just did. Occasionally, I want to note you might get a permission denied error. We'll get to that when installing extensions. We'll explain that in a bit and how to mitigate against that and go around it.
And just as a note for people who are interested, we will be sharing the slides afterwards. So we do have some cues and command line suggestions, so that will all be made available after the talk. Cool.
That's right. So how might you find JupyterLab extensions? Well, there's a GitHub topic for it now, so you can list. And so I've taken a screenshot. There's 65 repositories that tag themselves as being JupyterLab extensions. And of those, we're going to highlight a few. But also, I want to point out that when we had this extension manager enabled, I can just start typing here, and I get a bunch of results. So it's calling out to NPM and trying to find specific tags and things that you might be able to install. So that's another way of discovering extensions, with the caveat that look ahead to make sure that it's legit and it's not, the off by one typo character with the ones replaced with I's and the I's replaced with ones. Not that that's ever happened on Twitter from the keynote this morning. All right. So a couple extensions, shout outs that we want to sort of give you a level of the sort of thing we won't be demoing with code today because they're just involved and they're kind of more elaborate. One is from Plotly. So over here you see they're typing out code. They've pulled out the the display area of this graph and drag it over to the right. That's something you can do with JupyterLab. But now as they make changes to further to that object later on down the line, the object knows about those changes and will update itself like so. Another extension is the JupyterLab Draw.io plugin. So this is a demo when it works. It's a demo of scalable vector graphics drawing program inside of JupyterLab. You'll notice the familiar left pane there, and what this allows you to do is make vector graphics inside of JupyterLab and then export them and use them in your presentations, things like that. Yet another example is the JupyterLab GitHub plugin. So what this allows you to do is you notice that this created a new left pane. So it's a new file browser, except it's no ordinary file browser. It's actually hitting the GitHub API. So this is hitting the JupyterLab organization and the JupyterLab-GitHub repository of that organization. And it's able to pull those files out and represent them live. So this is the README of this project that we're demoing here. So there's a screenshot of it in the README, and so if it's all recursive. And
for those of you who are fans of the recursive butter model.
Yeah, Lady Lakes, the Droste effect, it's all there. It's all there. Yep. Great. So Mark, the protagonist in The Martian, said that all my brilliant plans are foiled by thermodynamics, damn you, entropy, right? So at some point, we've showed you how to list extensions, but you might want to disable it, right? And you might want to uninstall it altogether. So there's ways of doing that, and this may happen temporarily, and then those extensions get updated to the new APIs, and then things are happy again. But you want to stick around and poke around and make sure that this is happening, that this is something that you want to do. Okay, and then the same Mark, it was Mark, wasn't it? I didn't actually read the book.
Yeah.
Mark? Yeah, someone? Matt Damon. Matt Damon also said that, I will take control of the craft in international waters without permission. That makes me a pirate, a space pirate. So this is back to that permission issue that you might run into. So if JupyterLab is installed system-wide and you're a lowly user that can't access, user, share, whatever, right? When you try to install extensions, it will try to install them there, and then you won't have permissions to do that. And what's a user to do? Well, a user can use the apter flag parameter or an environment variable called JupyterLab_dir when instantiating JupyterLab or when calling that lab extension command in order to install extensions into a different place. And then thereafter, every time you launch JupyterLab with this apter flag set, then it'll assemble those packages and have them ready. This is what is going to allow us to do all these demos is that we have one instance of JupyterLab installed, the Python package, but when we're instantiating it, we're instantiating with different app directories where we've installed sort of one plugin each, so we don't have these plugins interfering with each other.
Great. All right, so everything we've talked about up till now has been customizations that you get out of the box with JupyterLab or existing third-party extensions. So if you're in a place where there isn't an extension yet that is doing the customization that you want, you can create your own extensions. So now we're going to walk through a series of different types of simpler extensions just for the sake of time and to make things a little bit clearer about how extensions work under the hood. So I want to start with a basic key binding extension, but we're going to look at the plugin logic behind the extension. Where a plugin here is something that I'm defining as code that adds functionality to the JupyterLab application. So before we dive into the plugin code, a little bit more about what plugins are. Plugins can require other plugins. We'll go over some examples of that later on. The key binding extension that I'm going to start with doesn't. A plugin itself is activated when it's needed by other plugins or it's activated explicitly. Plugins can require and provide token objects. I'll get into token objects a little bit later in an example around customizing the menu. But I also want to emphasize, too, that the module providing plugins has to export a plugin object or array of plugins as the default export. So at this point, you might be asking, if that's plugin, what are the extensions that we've been talking about up to this point? The extension itself is the NPM package. And so the requirements for what makes an NPM package is that it exports one or more JupyterLab plugin as the default export in its main file. And I'll actually show this in code, but the package.json for that extension is going to have a JupyterLab key in it, and that key has extension metadata. So in all of our extension examples, that value is set to true, so that just defaults to the main module of the package. But if you do have a package that has several modules, you can specify a string path, such as like libfoo. All right, so let's look at some code. So this is my key binding extension logic. So you can see here that I have an activate function, and that activate function is provided a JupyterLab application object. So a little bit about that object. It has a few things. One of them is commands, which you're going to see me using here. This lets you add and execute commands in the application. It also has a key map, and so that also lets you add keyboard shortcuts and a shell. A quick note on the shell, the JupyterLab shell is used to add and interact with content in the application. So as we mentioned before, you're going to see here that I'm exporting the extension as default. And so for people building extensions, I just want to quickly note that there are a few cookie cutter templates that you can use to more quickly spin up extensions versus coding them from scratch yourself. So for JavaScript, you have extension cookie cutter JS, and for TypeScript, you have extension cookie cutter TS. So I want to jump right back really quickly to the activate method. So here you can see that I'm using the app object, its commands, and I'm adding a key binding. So my new key binding is actually going to create the launcher. So typically you would do that from the icon here, but let's say I want that as a key binding instead. So I'm setting the keys for that key binding to $N, and I'm also specifying where that key binding is active. So to see this in action, I can go to any notebook here and type NN, and here you have the launcher. I want to quickly note that the advanced settings editor that Paul showed also lets you set your custom key bindings, but if you'd like to do that programmatically, this is an option. And I think a really good example of an extension that sets key bindings is the Vim extension. So it does what we're doing here, but for a set of key binding overrides.
Yep.
All right, cool. And really quickly, just to demystify the difference between plugins and extensions, we mentioned that extensions have the package.json, and here you can see that I'm setting my JupyterLab key and extension to true.
On line 36.
36, yeah, good stuff. All right, cool. So there are a few different ways to extend JupyterLab, or put another way, I'm going to quote this, so programmatically build pieces that others can extend. So that is from the read the docs of
must be true.
JupyterLab. Yeah, must be true. So this is all modular. So the key binding extension that we saw is what we call an application plugin. So at a high level, application plugins extend the functionality of JupyterLab. So with these type of plugins, you can do, as we saw, things like adding key binding. I'm going to show you next, customizing the menu and doing multiple other things. So before we dive into more extensions, I do want to take a moment to note that in JupyterLab, all extensions are on an equal footing. And they interact with each other through typed interfaces that are provided by the token objects that I mentioned before. So next, I do want to walk through an extension that shows those token objects in action. All right, so how many of you have used the classic notebook? Yes, everyone? Yeah. So if you have, you're familiar with the cell submenu, where it collects a variety of cell operations. You'll notice that in JupyterLab, you have a different set of submenu options, but you might want to recreate that cell menu for yourself to have a convenient clustering of those action items. So here, if we go to the code for this extension, you can see that it's pretty similar to our last key binding extension in that it has an activate method that takes in JupyterLab, but it also takes in main menu, which is another extension. I want to point out that here we're also requiring that main menu as part of this extension. So that's what I was going back to earlier in saying that extensions can require and provide to other extensions. I do want to note as well that we're importing a few more things than we had in our key binding extension, and also that when you do add more dependencies, you want to make sure that your package.json is also up to date with those dependencies, because if you don't, you're going to get build errors. All right, so let's walk through what this activate function is actually doing. So you can see here that it's taking in the main menu. At the end of the day, that's going to let us actually add our sub-menu to the existing application menu, which is what we're doing here on line 68. But we're also creating a new menu object, and so that is what's happening on line 28. So I create my new JupyterLab menu, I give it a title, I add all the items that match what I had in the classic notebook, and then at the end, I place it, and I want to note here that I'm setting like the rank of where it exists, and so you can customize that yourself. If I wanted this to show up before file, I could set that rank to -1, and then I add to my main menu. So you can see this in action here. So here I have my cell menu, and I can do something like run all cells, and it's actually going to run all the cells. So these are real extensions in the wild. Okay. All right, so one last extension that I want to walk through that's a little bit more involved is the toolbar extension. So many times it might be that you want to add additional icons to the toolbar beyond the base set that you get, which includes things like save, cut, run, and stop. So this extension, I want to talk a little bit about the mechanics behind it. The notebook toolbar itself maintains a list of widgets to add to the toolbar. Through the application's doc registry, which is where document types and factories are registered, we can add a widget extension. So in our code, that's going to be the button extension. And so this is going to add a new button to the toolbar. So you can see here I'm creating my new button. I'm setting the icon class, and so you can customize that icon. You can import different icons here. And I'm also setting the callback, so what happens when I click my button. In this case, it's going to clear all output. And then you can see here I'm adding it to the panel's toolbar. All right, so let's see that in action. So if I click toolbar,
there's output right now.
Yep, and it's going to clear. All right, good stuff. So as you can see with this set of 3, they're relatively simple extensions, but they're pretty easy to spin up, and there's not too much code involved in customizing things like as critical as the menu and the toolbar items. Okay.
So another example that I want to show is a MIME renderer extension. So this was written here at JupyterCon for one of the JupyterLab tutorials by Ian Rose. And by default in JupyterLab, there's no way to open movies, but Ian's implemented just an MP4 player right here. So when you double-click on, when I double-click on this craftwork.mp4, it'll actually open it up, and it has a provider in there to actually play. To be able to play these videos, and I happen to use a Kraftwerk video that has no motion whatsoever.
It is a video.
It's a video, and it is playing. I assure you. There you go. So yeah. All right. That's enough of that.
Is it? No. Can't have too much.
Can't have too much of that. So there is a MIME cutter, MIME renderer, cookie cutter provider, I guess is what you'd call it, where you can create. You have a file type that you want to visualize in a certain way. You can do that. I want to point out there were enough people in the audience that hadn't used JupyterLab before that I want to point out that, for example, for JSON objects, we have multiple ways of opening them. So you can open it as a JSON view, which is a read-only view that allows you to sort of indicate that. So this is what this MIME renderer would provide. We could have multiple MP4 players figured out here. So yeah, that's all I want to say about that.
Cool. So Paul walked through one flavor of extension. The other one that I want to talk about briefly is theme extensions. So a theme is a JupyterLab extension that uses what's called a theme manager, and themes can be loaded and unloaded dynamically. So JupyterLab itself comes with two themes, as Paul is demoing. You get the dark and the light out of the box. And so the light theme code itself has an index.ts and a package.json, and in the activate method of that function for that theme extension, they take the theme manager and use it to register the theme. So if you wanted to quickly spin up your own theme based on the JupyterLab Lite theme, there is a command that you can run. And again, we'll share these commands with you after the talk. JLPM run, create theme. And you can run that, as Paul is, from your repository root directory. You're going to be prompted for a name, a title, and a description.
When it works.
When it works, yes. And then from there, you can take that theme and customize it and do things around font, appearance, graphics. And so there are really a lot of ways that you can tailor a UI, based on visually how you'd like it to render. Cool. Yeah, so that's all we're going to say about themes for sake of time. But again, that's a pretty quick, flavor of extension to spin up and a quick way to customize your IDE environment.
Yeah, I want to read a quote by Paul Feyerabend that's relevant here for this last part. Variety of opinion is necessary for objective knowledge, and a method that encourages variety is also the only method that is compatible with a humanitarian outlook. So you have opinions, but they might not be the exact opinions that went behind creating JupyterLab. Like, what are you to do? Are you to just have to rewrite everything from scratch on your own, or just be stuck in the terminal forever? Well, no, there's hope. And there's ways for you to still enjoy these plugins and remix them in a different way. So the primary way, or the primary starting point, would be in the JupyterLab Git repository. There's an examples directory, which has several standalone plugins that are exposed as whole things that aren't JupyterLab, and then including one that is called an app that's a JupyterLab-like thing that can't also install extensions and things like that. So, and a version of remixing these things that's out there that you can use today is scripted forms and ThebeLab, which I have been pronounced as ThebeLab, but apparently I'm wrong. But both of those turn static HTML pages into live document in slightly different ways. So in the case of scripted forms, it's the backend is wherever the web server is running. In the case of ThebeLab, the compute backend is typically Binder or something else that's provided. It's part of the web page. There's a configuration there for where that code should run and how it should get executed.
Cool.
With that, I think that's all the material that we prepared for you today. Thank you so much. We'll take any questions. Yeah, so it's figured out in the typical JavaScript way where there's a package JSON file. I shouldn't be using VI. I should just be opening it that way. But it specifies which version of Anyway, it specifies on this line which version. Let me.
So that's the JupyterLab/application. You pin that version.
Yep, exactly.
And then if you don't specify that, you won't run into that error at all.
But you'll run into worse errors, I think.
Yes.
You'll run into much less descriptive errors. Yeah. So I would just want to repeat the question for the recording. The question was about how do you specify which, when you're developing an extension, which ones you depend on. Yeah.
Yeah. Question there?
So if I want to make an extension that has a lot of visual elements in it, or wants to reuse visual elements, like say the drop-down menu from other parts of the JupyterLab UI, like what is the underlying architecture of JupyterLab, and is it possible for us to reuse components of it? Like, is it written in React, regular? We can just also use React and sort of plug it in, or is it sort of like walled off, and we just have to use our little corner of the JavaScript?
Do you want to mention Phosphor?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
under the hood, we have a Phosphor library that does provide a base set of widgets that many of the extensions in JupyterLab build off of. So that's one option, depending on which exact widget that you wanted to reuse. But then I want to tie back to the fact that extensions themselves provide interfaces and objects that other extensions can use. So when I was making that main menu, cell menu extension, I wasn't reinventing the menu object from scratch. I was actually using the menu extension to create my own submenu and add it back to the main menu. So in cases like that, I don't know if you want to add anything?
I think that was good. And to the point earlier, it's written in Phosphor, but Phosphor does allow you to embed React components. So Phosphor itself is, you have components and you can remix those pieces, but if you want to bring in React, there's a way of doing that as well. Yeah.
With the after stuff, the custom extensions for users, when can we expect that sort of integration with Jupyter Hub? Because right now, that works if you have your own environment.
Yep. So the question is about with the after stuff, when can we expect that to be available in Jupyter Hub as sort of a first-class citizen? Very good question. I don't know, but yeah, I think we should work on that and make that happen. That totally makes sense. I have unfortunately not had the chance to work very much with Jupyter Hub, but that's good excuse as any. I want to show off one more extension that I've built here that to give you yet another sort of flavor of both the workflow that you might have in building an extension. So here you'll notice the red bar. I'm running JupyterLab in dev mode. So as I make changes to it, it will live reload pieces that have changed so long as those pieces were already there when I launched it. So it won't work for new files, but once you've put the files there, then it'll live reload. So that's a much faster iterative cycle for developing things. And what I've done here is I created a new submenu. So not a top-level menu, but a submenu of recently opened things. So as I click things, it'll switch over and it'll maintain a list so that now that untitled.to ipynb will be at the top, and you'll notice that it's all been deduplicated, like it's not there. And I can clear it, and then when I go back here. So that's another example of the kind of extension. Because you might, again, this is back to, you might have opinions. Maybe that recently opened should be frequently opened, or something like that, right? So that's another little thing that we did. And I always like to sort of end talks awkwardly. Thank you. Are we happy to answer more questions at the end? I think we're at time. Oh, we still have 5 minutes? Oh, we still have 5 minutes. All right. Scott?
What's the expected workflow for testing your extensions? Are there facilities that JupyterLab provides for like setting up a reasonable lock environment?
So about the, I didn't hear a question about testing. So next question. Yeah, so unfortunately, as far as I know, there's unit testing type of things, and there is some I'm missing the word, headless Chrome type of stuff going on, but it's not. It could be a happier place, definitely, yeah. And we'll get there. I think that will be necessary. The much nicer part of JupyterLab world, as opposed to the Wild West of the classic notebook, is at least you get a lot more guardrails and bumpers where you're not going to hit a gutter ball just because whatever. That's a golf analogy? No. Yeah. And that's because of TypeScript. Sorry, I didn't finish that thought. Oh yeah, layout construction. That's true. That was one of the planned pieces that didn't make it in, so we had to cut it for time. But the idea is that when you've laid these things out, this is one way of doing it, right? Wouldn't it be nice to just be able to collapse it all? So you could write an extension to do that, to reorder things or change the tiling and things like that. You're right. We will make that available in our GitHub repo, which is linked to from here, but it's not there right now. Yeah, we had to cut it for time.
Is it possible to save different layouts?
Absolutely, yeah. So another way of saving layouts, which we're also utilizing here, is that you'll notice I have a particular URL here. So this is workspaces key bindings. And if I if I reload it in the browser, it comes back to me. But I can also make a new workspace. I don't need the XKCD extension, thank you. So I can just go to the standard place, that's there, and now this will be my layout here, and that will get saved if I reload again. Okay, so that's untitled, but if I click back and I go back to that workspaces key binding, it's still there as it was. So workspaces is a way of saving the layout of the windows and being able to come back to them, of the files that you have open, things like that.
So you're using the word workspace and layout equivalent?
No, I would think of those as a little bit different.
A little bit different, yeah. But
So when you open an application, I think you also have the option of saving different workspaces per instance of your JupyterLab. I mean, if we're talking about layout, that's also something like a workspace itself could incorporate a layout. I wouldn't say that they're mutually exclusive.
yeah.
Yeah, I don't, probably confused more than the answer, but.
Yep. Anybody else?
Oh, all right, well, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.